Hi, this video will discuss the relationship between marginal productivity and marginal cost. It will also discuss the relationship between average productivity and average variable costs. So it's something to keep in mind. Where you're most productive is where your costs are the lowest. And that concept will be displayed on the graph. So let's pull up the graph. On the top graph, we have marginal and average productivity. And on the horizontal axis is your amount of input. On the bottom graph is your cost graph, where we have output on the horizontal. Let's first look at the marginal productivity graph here in blue. Marginal productivity initially is increasing, becoming more productive. After this point of input, where marginal productivity is maximized, then we have diminishing marginal productivity, which even turns negative if you add even further amounts of input. Compare this blue marginal productivity graph with the green marginal cost graph below. So marginal cost has a U shape. It declines initially, reaches a minimum of the U, and then goes back up. So then to recap, right here is the peak of the marginal productivity when this amount of input is used in the process. That corresponds to a minimum of the marginal cost curve. So where you're most productive in terms of marginal productivity, your marginal cost of making that item are the lowest. And when marginal productivity is rising, we notice that marginal costs are falling. After this peak in marginal productivity, where we have diminishing marginal productivity, so marginal productivity with additional units of input are falling. What's happening to marginal cost? Well, no surprise here, they're rising. As you increase your inputs, your output's increasing, but your marginal costs are going up. So this will always happen. The peak of your marginal productivity will correspond to the minimum of your marginal cost. When your marginal productivity is falling, your marginal costs are rising. Where your marginal productivity is rising, your marginal costs are falling. So these are inverse images of each other, marginal cost and marginal productivity. Now let's turn our attention to the averages. Average product is in red. It rises for a given amount of time. Where it intersects the marginal productivity, that's the peak of the average productivity. So when your marginal productivity is above the average productivity, average goes up. Where your marginal productivity is below the average, your average falls. But note here, this point is the peak of your average productivity. Now let's look at the average variable cost. Average variable cost has the opposite shape. It's declining initially, like a U, where it intersects marginal cost is its minimum, and then it goes back up. Okay? And note that where your average productivity is the highest, okay, at this point here is the highest, that corresponds to the same amount of output where your average variable costs reach its minimum right here. So this will always happen as well. Where your average productivity is maximized, your average variable costs are minimized. When your average productivity is rising, your average variable cost will be falling. And where your average productivity after this maximum point are declining, your average productivity are on their way, your average variable costs, are on their way up, where average productivity is on its way down. So this is a relationship, another inverse relationship between average product and average variable costs. These will always have inverse shapes of each other. And your marginal productivity will always have an inverse shape of marginal cost.